The Iran war has triggered what experts are now calling the largest oil supply shock in modern history. And the numbers are staggering. In just 50 days of conflict, the world has effectively lost more than $50 billion worth of crude oil that was never produced, never shipped, and never sold. Over 500 million barrels of oil have been wiped out of the global market since late February, tightening supply chains and shaking the very foundations of the global energy system. This is not just another war headline. This is an economic shock unfolding in real time, one that is already reshaping energy markets, inflation trends, and geopolitical power balances in ways that will be felt for years to come. At the peak of the crisis, production outages reached nearly 12 million barrels per day. 12 million barrels. That is a massive chunk of global supply simply disappearing from the market overnight. Global investors have already absorbed significant losses. And the worst of the economic consequences may not yet be fully visible in the data. At the center of this crisis lies the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply normally flows every single day. When the conflict escalated and tanker traffic was disrupted, it was not just a regional problem, it was a global one. Every economy on the planet that runs on oil, which is to say every economy on the planet, felt the disruption immediately. Historically, the world has experienced oil shocks before. The 1973 oil embargo, the Gulf War, the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022. But analysts are now saying that the 2026 Iran war may rival or even exceed all of those crises in scale and duration. The International Energy Agency has described the current situation as the greatest global energy security challenge in history, warning that supply disruptions are already reversing earlier projections of growth in global oil production. That is not a regional warning. That is a planetary one. And the consequences are not limited to oil markets alone. This supply shock is rippling through the entire global economy in ways that are compounding on each other. Oil prices surged toward $150 per barrel at the height of the crisis, before stabilizing near the $100 range. That level of volatility, that speed of movement, created chaos across financial markets and pushed inflation risk higher across every major economy simultaneously. For ordinary consumers, the impact is immediate and painful. Higher oil prices translate directly into more expensive transportation, higher food costs, and rising utility bills. Everything that moves, and everything that is made by something that moves, costs more. Economists are warning that a prolonged disruption at this scale could trigger a cycle of stagflation, that dangerous combination of slow economic growth and high inflation that haunted the global economy throughout the 1970s and took years of painful policy to unwind. That is the scenario that governments are quietly trying to prevent right now. But here is where the story becomes considerably more complex. While consumers and governments struggle under the weight of higher prices and supply uncertainty, some of the world's largest companies are making enormous profits. Analysts have shown that the world's largest oil and gas firms earned windfall gains running into the billions of dollars during the first month of the conflict alone, benefiting directly from soaring prices and supply shortages that were devastating everyone else. This paradox, economic pain for consumers, record profits for producers, is fueling political debates across the world and raising serious questions about who this crisis is actually serving and who it is actually hurting. Another critical factor shaping the depth of this crisis is infrastructure damage. The war has not only disrupted shipping routes, it has physically damaged refineries, pipelines, and liquefied natural gas installations across the region. Some of that energy infrastructure could take months or even years to return to full operational capacity. The destruction is not just about what cannot flow right now. It is about what cannot flow 6 months from now, or a year from now, even if a ceasefire holds today. And that leads directly to the most consequential strategic question policymakers are facing. How long will the recovery actually take? Even under the most optimistic scenario, a ceasefire that holds, talks that succeed, and a genuine political resolution, the physical recovery of energy production will be a slow and complicated process. Oil wells must be inspected, pipelines must be repaired, shipping networks must be rebuilt and reinsured. In some cases, heavy crude fields in countries like Iraq and Kuwait may require several months just to resume normal operations. The uncertainty surrounding those recovery timelines is already changing global behavior in profound ways. Countries are rushing to secure alternative supply routes. Strategic reserves are being built at emergency pace. Trade routes that took decades to optimize are being redesigned almost overnight. There is also a geopolitical dimension to this crisis that cannot be separated from the economic one. Control over energy routes has always been a source of power in international relations. The Iran war is reinforcing that reality, with a clarity that no diplomatic speech ever could. Whoever controls access to the Strait of Hormuz effectively holds leverage over the global economy. That is not a metaphor. That is an operational fact that every government on the planet is now reckoning with simultaneously. At the same time, the crisis is accelerating the global transition toward renewable energy in a way that years of policy debate never achieved. Solar, wind, and nuclear power are becoming more strategically attractive as governments seek to reduce their exposure to exactly this kind of geopolitical shock. Analysts are arguing that the 2026 oil shock could mark a turning point in energy history, similar to the crisis of the 1970s that ultimately triggered a major wave of investment in alternative energy technologies. The difference is that this time, the transition tools are already mature, already cost-competitive, and already being deployed at scale. The Iran war is not creating the energy transition. It is accelerating one that was already underway, compressing what might have taken a decade into a fraction of that time. Whether this crisis ultimately stabilizes or continues to escalate will depend on 3 things moving in the right direction simultaneously. Diplomacy producing a durable political resolution, infrastructure recovery proceeding faster than the damage compounds, and governments managing the economic fallout in ways that prevent the kind of social and political instability that historically follows prolonged energy shocks. None of those 3 things is guaranteed. None of them is even close to certain right now. What is certain is that the world that comes out the other side of this crisis will have a fundamentally different relationship with energy, with supply chains, and with the geopolitical leverage that comes from controlling the narrow waterways through which civilization flows. The question worth sitting with is this. When the dust finally settles on the 2026 Iran conflict, who will have used this crisis to build something lasting? And who will simply have absorbed the cost and returned to the same vulnerabilities that made this shock possible in the first place? History suggests the answer depends entirely on who is willing to ask the harder questions before the next crisis arrives, not after.